I have another question here, Gary, maybe this one's for you. It basically says, how can I be sure I will get paid in a timely manner for billing? For billing I do as a solo consultant. Can I expect to get paid straight away, or does it take time? Should I factor this into my rate? And this is a question we received from Asia. Yeah, that's can you handle that one, Gary?
Yeah, I'll give you my experience. You know, guarantee, I guess it depends on who you're working for. Hopefully they're a reputable company, and you just got to ask those questions up front and make sure you understand how the process will work, because I have a range of folks. I have some, you know, through MBO, I have a range. One company, if I turn the hours in by Friday, that I get paid the next Friday. I mean, it's like clockwork. The other one they only want to be invoiced once a month, and then they have 45 days to pay. So I may do work the first day of February and not get paid until May or June. So, you know, now they will pay the expenses a little faster, but the hourly pay. So you've got to understand that, and if that's not acceptable, either renegotiate it or, you know, find some way to have a cash flow. But you know, plus it makes it a little more difficult if it's, you know, if it's 2 months, it's hard to keep up with expenses, or I have found it to be, to, you know, stay on top of what I've invoiced. So you have to have good record keeping so that you know that, hey, I actually got paid for that work I did 6 weeks ago. But to me, it's a case by case.
Yeah, and I would think that if you know the client has a history of long payment for whatever reason, either through their bureaucracy or the terms they've set up, or their payment patterns, if you could discover that, which there are ways to do, then you probably should add that to your bill rate. You know, it is a variable cost. It's the cost of money. It's the cost of cash flow, and you know, it could be pretty devastating to you know, someone who's really counting on that cash flow, obviously. So really good point.
One other point I would make, Gene, is that
go ahead.
If there's a contractor that you're working for that's working for the government, I mean, sometimes the government can be the hardest and slowest to get paid. And again, take that into account. Who's paying the person you're working for? If you're working for the person that's paying, that's one thing. But if you are a subcontractor to somebody, you got to know who they're getting paid by.
Yeah, which is also usually a negotiated term in the contract. I mean, there's contracts out there which, you know, again, another topic for another future webinar is, you know, the whole contracting issue. And sometimes there are you know, some of the government integrators that negotiate into the contract that the consultant gets paid when they get paid, like Gary said, which could be based on certain completion parameters they have with the government, and it's really hard to know the exact timing of when you'd get paid. So those are pretty important clauses to make sure you understand. Anyway, we have another question here, which is what are some of the unexpected overhead or indirect labor costs that could come up, and how did this affect profits? So I would think that other, you know, I'll just quickly answer that if I understand the question. Unexpected overhead, it's probably things that you know, you obviously didn't plan for. Could be things like insurance you're required to have. Some clients require things like a crime bond, which is, you know, perhaps a requirement of them doing business, and you have to go out and buy that insurance. There's sometimes and oftentimes there's background checks required by clients. Those are unexpected or additional costs. Obviously, there's taxes. Usually a big one. You know, a lot of independent consultants don't necessarily properly plan for all of their taxes, and it comes the end of the year, there's either a tax bill or potential penalty because you didn't properly estimate taxes during the year. So unfortunately, there's lots of unexpected expenses, but as you get experienced over time and get good advice, those go away. Another question I'm going to get here from Vivian. Is it customary also in the private sector to pay the subcontractor only when the ultimate client makes the payment? Vivian, I will say that is not customary.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think customary is typically, well, the most that I see in the private sector is 30 days. Any sooner than that, that's great. Any later than that, you're past the standard. I don't know, Gene, if you would agree.
Well, I would say maybe probably 45 days, but yeah, 30 days would be great. I would say over 60 days is bad, but I don't think in the private sector that they tie that clause to it is when they get paid, unless you're dealing with perhaps a smaller company that can't carry the cash flow.
Right, and so, if you're the subcontractor in that case, then you should try to change the language of that contract to actually specify the amount of days rather than just paid when paid.
Okay, another question, and thanks for all these questions, all the listeners. This is really, really good, and I hope everybody's getting some value out of this. So we have another question here from Ayub, if I'm saying that right. I apologize if I'm not. Good afternoon. Good afternoon to you too. I would like to know what is the best trade-off between billing accurately small companies and building long-term relationships with a pool of smart or medium companies. Good question. I think if I understand the question properly, you're asking, is it better to have small companies that perhaps you're charging a little bit more to, or if you're working on longer-term relationships, you then might want to stay closer to that. And I think Gary referenced this earlier. If it's a larger client and it's long-term, your cost is actually lower. And if you really think through the model that Steve presented earlier, your utilization will go up. So if you're working on a few clients that are larger and giving you longer-term assignments, you will probably have higher utilization of your hours, which means more hours billed divided by that cost, which means your rate could be lower. On the other hand, if you're working with a lot of small companies, although you could bill more per hour, you have starts and stops. So your utilization, if you don't have them packed up and scheduled right back to back, your utilization may go down. I think in the long run, having a good mix is the right answer because you want to be diversified. Obviously, having a few clients that are big and long term, you have all your eggs in one or two baskets, right? If you have a lot of the small clients, they'll tend to pay higher. You'll get higher margin on them, but you will need to accumulate a good number of them. But you'll probably have more resilience to your ongoing billings because you'll have a larger pool of people to choose from. So good question.